pleased to see you all here. It was my idea to have this, as I thought that the material in the Christian Guardian under Egerton Ryerson's editorship is really interesting. Now, it's a bit harder to make the printed page come alive, and so it was not such a smart idea. So we've got a reader one and a reader two for the different sections. But the material is very good. Okay, yes, okay. So the Christian Guardian, these are the readers. We've got them paired to cover the different sections. We have a very long section on Indigenous relations because Ryerson started as editor in 1829, but he had been a missionary at the Credit 1826-27, so he was still very much in touch with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and he asked them to send him material, and they did send him material, and they sent him reports, lots and lots of things that they sent him, and he published it. And later editors published some of it, but these early years, there's really a lot of material. So we've got the Indigenous relations, that missionary endeavors by these Credit missionaries. Let me warn you, there's lots of religion in this session, so you will hear it coming out, and with a lot of enthusiasm. Next slide, please. So the material, a lot of it was taken from other newspapers and magazines. It came out every week, and so there are lots of little excerpts. So Ryerson could pick up these things, and he did that, and then he sometimes comments on it as well. But there are also a few advertisements in it, but they had to sell books as well. To keep it going, they had to sell, like Sunday school materials and so on, so that they did keep it going. It did work. But it was an effort to stay alive financially. Next one, please. So he was the founding editor, and he edited it basically on and off for about 10 years. But in the last years, it's not identified. It became the largest circulation magazine in Upper Canada. Ron Stagg is going to comment a bit later about the state of journalism in Upper Canada at the time, but the Christian Guardian really sailed ahead. And you see, it wasn't just a church magazine. It had church news, missionary news, temperance, Sunday school materials, but it also had political news. The Governor General is visiting. The House of Assembly has opened. These are the issues before the House. There's lots on political issues because Ryerson saw that they were very important. Next slide, please. So he used the Christian Guardian to raise issues that he wanted to move along. And he was a democratic person. He entirely disagreed with having an established church, which was the Church of England. The clergy reserves, the people's money went in to support it. And he followed democratic reforms in England and reported on them in the Christian Guardian, hoping that people would take an interest in Ontario and would be supported in that direction. UK reforms needed for responsible government was basically the title given to it. The people were elected and they had to survive. They had the executive. Upper Canada had an unelected overhouse, like the Senate, like the House of Lords, unelected. So Bishop Strong was in on that, and then of course the Lieutenant Governor was an appointed person. Well, Ryerson wanted democratic, that the elected people would have the say, and this was an ongoing struggle. It took a very long time. It took decades to get rid of the clergy reserves. So you see lots and lots of it in the paper. Needless to say, I didn't pull it out for discussion today because you would get terribly bored with some of these issues as they came along. I think we're just at the end of my introduction. There's a little bit on injustices to Indigenous people in both the US and in Canada. And that will be a little section at the end just to see how that was covered. And then slavery, of course, was a really big issue. Not an issue for Upper Canada, but an issue for the world, particularly for the British Empire. And so it got coverage in the Christian Guardian. So we have a fairly substantial section on slavery and its abolition. So and then one very long section within that is Ryerson happened to be in London for the last debate on the abolition of slavery Yeah. So he's sitting there in the gallery and taking it all down and reporting it back in Canada. I mean, very handy timing to be able to do that. That would have been fascinating. It took decades of debate, before a bill was actually passed. And then he covers the celebrations for the actual end of slavery the year later, in 1834, August 1st, 1834. So it's a really quite interesting material there. Okay, well, we'll see that. That will be come on in very early on in the Indigenous section. Next one, please. Okay. Oh, yes. There are interesting remarks about how, because Ryerson's very aware that slavery goes on in the U.S. to 1865. They got rid of it in Ontario in 1793.
Did they get rid of it in
we were really ahead of
1793?
them.
I didn't think it went through. I thought he proposed it, but it didn't go through.
You mean in 1793?
Yeah.
No, the first attempt did not go through. It got watered down, and the watered down, which made it gradual, did go through, which meant it began to happen, although it wasn't an overnight happening. So
You couldn't bring more slaves in after that.
but it also meant that there could be no new slaves.
I understand.
Yeah, so it made quite a difference. Okay, and then on the Fugitive Slave Act in 1858, Ryerson happened to be in Boston when there was a big rally, so he reports on it. That's 1850, that's a long time after the British Empire got rid of it. Okay, so in any event, let's get going with the first set, which is Len Fortune reading could be either with Bruce or with Andrew. Who wants to start off? We'll have one, and then we'll move on to the other. So.
And it leads, and Lynn is supposed to be commenting that Egerton Ryerson's older brother George, also a Methodist missionary, took over from him at the River Credit Mission Village. A report he sent in 1830 relates, about the middle of December, 20 Indians had some months before been visited by our native teachers, came from the southeast shore of Lake Huron to receive Christian instruction. Many miles in the wilderness, they had heard that God had done great things for their brothers at the Credit, and they came out to see for themselves and to learn the good way, as they called the Christian religion. We frequently had similar visits from parties of Indians inquiring the way to Zion. The uniform practice of the Christians on such occasions is to divide the visitors between 1, 2, or 3 families, according to their number, where they are hospitably entertained for the 2 or 3 or 4 weeks that they generally stay. The other Christian inhabitants of the village then send each his portion of corn or potatoes or venison, etc., to the house where the strangers are entertained. During their temporary residence, so indefatigable are the Christians in exhorting and instructing them and praying with them that they seldom return to the solitudes of the wilderness without more or less of them having experienced the salvation of God.
The 20 Indians of whom I was speaking were placed in an empty house near the mission house. I thus had an opportunity of more particularly observing the conduct of the Christians towards them, and the earnestness with which they listened to the word and the delight which they manifested in having the Christians sing and pray with them. Indeed, a large portion of each day and to a late hour at night was spent in singing and prayer. The day before quarterly meeting, the Christian Indians held a council in the chapel, the object of which was to devise means for clothing 3 poor native strangers. They immediately separated and shortly after returned, with one with a shirt, another with a handkerchief or trousers or blanket or moccasins, etc. Those were then distributed into 20 heaps, and the stranger being called into each received one, and was thus supplied with comfortable clothing.
One of them, an old chief, returned thanks for the whole. He explained his ideas by such comparisons and illustrations as might be expected from one who had spent his whole life in the depths of the forest. He seemingly alluded to the happy state of his brothers at the credit, living in the enjoyment of good religion. He spoke of the religion of our Lord Jesus Christ as a tree planted by the Great Spirit and reaching up to heaven.
Thank you. The next day, Christmas, 13 of these Indians, after much religious instruction and careful examination as to their knowledge and experience of religion, were solemnly received as members of the Christian Church by the Reverend William Ryerson, presiding elder, and dedicated themselves to the service of God in the Christian baptism.
It will be obvious that these new converts happily spent so much of their time on meetings, classes, and ceremonies. The love feast, described as special, however, communion services or the Lord's Supper had no wine, and the love feast only had water too. It is also obvious from these reports that the missionaries were careful to check that the converts knew what they were doing. They would only be baptized after some lapse of time had taken place.
Next verse. On Christmas Day, our love fest commenced about 9 o'clock. The chapel was filled principally with native Christians and their children. It was a happy season. Every eye overflowed and every heart was melted into love. A divine atmosphere appeared to pervade the little assembly, and the heart-melting and humbling influence of the Spirit of God to unite everyone in love as the soul of one man. The involuntary language of my heart was by thy banner over us to love. Hopefully that makes sense. After the public service, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was administered to 94 Indian converts and 18 white brethren. During the love feast, many of the natives spoke of their religious experience and of what God had done for them.
It is such scenes and such seasons as those that encourage the heart of the missionary. These wells of salvation by the road of his pilgrimage, from time to time, refresh and comfort his soul while passing through the valley of Baca, weeping, and constantly explain in the triumphant language of truth, the Lord is my shepherd, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God through salvation. Dear brothers, yours affectionately, George Ryerson.
In a speech Peter Jones gave to the Methodist Missionary Society in London in 1831, his remarks were personal, relating his own conversation and witness to his own family and friends, and where he used the Indigenous Great Spirit for God as he did in Canada.
Contrary to the accusations in circulation, Ryerson was not assimilationist, but wanted Indigenous people to maintain their own native language. Bible passages and hymns were translated into Ojibwe and Mohawk. Ryerson reported that the hymns especially were greatly appreciated. When he gave away several Chippewa hymn books and the scriptures translated in the Chippewa tongue, they received them with apparent joy. Methodist missionaries absorbed Indigenous expressions and used them in their own speaking and writing. There was a decidedly two-way traffic. For Indigenous people, God was the Great Spirit, and this expression often appears in the Christian Guardian in its early issues when Ryerson was the editor.
The exchange of terms for God between the settlers Methodists in the Indigenous paraphrase from the Bible, in parenthesis, Corinthians 5:1. For we know that our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved. We have a building of God, and house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. This became that if the earthly wigwam of this tabernacle were dissolved, they would have a building of God, a wigwam not made with hands, eternal in the heavens.
Next comes a report from the devout Indigenous Christian Shawudis, English name John Sunday, on his mission to the northwestern Indians in 1831. The York referred to is, of course, Toronto.
John Sunday belongs to the Great Island body of Indians. He was converted to Christianity a little more than 5 years ago. Though he was a married man and 29 years of age when he was converted and could understand but very little English, he applied himself to learning so that he is now able to read and understand both the Old and New Testament, and can write a very sure hand. His natural talents are of the first rate. His action and speaking in the language of nature to life. His power of eloquence and oratory in his own language on religious subjects are said to be such as cannot be resisted by a Christian congregation of Indians, and seldom fails to move an unconverted one. His discourse and conversation abound with the most apt and striking illustrations, taken from the surrounding objects and passing occurrences, and by the fervor of his uniform and rationality, piety, and his ardent love to his perishing people. His whole soul enters into his subject, which at once appears to be animated throughout with a supernatural life and spirit. And what is more, a remarkable divine influence evidently accompanies his humble labors.
It will be recollected by the readers of the first volume of our paper that Sunday and two of his brethren were sent on a mission to those distant tribes at the north and west last summer, a year, that their mission resulted in the conversion of nearly 20 of their heathen brethren and the opening of an encouraging field of missionary enterprise.
After consulting upon the measure, our General Superintendent determined last June upon a second mission to these distant and perishing nations. John Sunday and two of his native brethren at Grape Island, Joseph Skunk and Thomas Frazier, were selected for this purpose. They left Grape Island June the 9th, took a canoe to a word I should be able to pronounce, Penetang. Yeah. Well, and after a tedious passage of 19 days on the north shore of Lake Huron, arrived at Mackinac, which is 350 miles distant from Penetang, we use the modern term, and upwards of 400 miles from York. Mackinac is a post of some importance belonging to the Americans. It contains a considerable number of respectable white inhabitants as well as Indians.
On account of the length of the passage from Penetang to Mackinac, Sunday and his companions exhausted their store of provisions and were obliged to shoot crows, etc., to supply the demands of nature. The particulars of this journey, together with Sunday's labors during a week at Mackinac, will be found in his own words in the place already referred to. We've got Sunday's journal translated and inserted it in our columns in order to exhibit Christianity in its naked simplicity and in fidelity to reduce such an example to show the spirit in which the humble apostles sought to bring into the fold of Christ the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to give a true picture of the Indian character in the heathen and Christianized state, to present a living proof of the reality and blessedness of the supernatural internal power and evidence in the religion of Jesus Christ.
From Mickinock Sunday intended to have gone to Green Bay and to visit the numerous tribes in that region, was induced to relinquish this design by Mr. Mitchell at Mickinock, who told him that the Indians in the vicinity of Green Bay did not speak the Chippewa language. Sunday then directed his course to Sault Ste. Marie, the connecting river between Lake Huron and Superior, and all the 90 miles northwest of Mickinock, where he continued his incessant and successful labors for upwards of 9 weeks, when he embarked on board of a vessel for Detroit. From thence, on board of a steamboat for Buffalo, and thence to York, where he arrived on the 22nd of this month, after an absence of more than 4 months. The early issues of the Christian Guardian, when Ryerson was editor or lead editor, included many stories of missionary trips by Indigenous missionary. Is this the one we've already done? Have we
I think we have the wrong word. Just go on.
Okay, we start
Just go to
with portions of a long letter from Peter Jones, Ryerson's closest Indigenous friend. I'm not going to say his Indigenous name, or Sacred Feathers. I think I've already said this. He was both a missionary and an elected chief, a trusted leader to take the line claims to the British authorities. Dear brother, as you requested me to give you an account of my late visit to Grand River, I now send you the following extracts from my journal. On the 25th of November last, Tom McGee, John Thompson, and myself, all Indigenous men, left the Credit in order to visit the tribe of Chippewas on Lake Huron. So on the Sabbath the 29th, we arrived at the mission house. I found them engaged in the Sunday school. There were 25 scholars present, mostly young men and women, who were instructed by some of the Indians themselves, both in Mohawk and English. About noon, public worship commenced. There were about 40 present, who appeared to be deeply engaged in prayer during the exercises of the meeting. After preaching, we had a class meeting. I was informed that the reformation of the Salt Spring Mission was still in a prospering condition.
On the 1st of December, I met with about 20 of the Lake Huron Indians with Brother Thomas McGee and John Thomas of Abraham's Herb in Waterloo, and was welcomed by the newly converted heathens. We sang, prayed, and thanked the Great Spirit for bringing us together. In the evening, we had a meeting at the Dutch schoolhouse. All the Indians attended. We commenced by singing and prayer, after which I addressed them on the goodness of God in preserving our lives and in bringing us to know and to feel the necessity of serving the Great Spirit. When I got through speaking to my Indian brethren, I spoke in English to the Dutch people present, who listened with the greatest attention. We gave out another appointment for tomorrow evening at this place.
December 2nd. In the morning, we commenced the exercises of the day without our Indian friends. In the afternoon, I instructed them of the 5th chapter of Matthew 1-16, the Sermon of the Mount. Brother Thomas McGee and John Thompson exhorted. Several of the Indians were much affected during the meeting. According to our appointment, we assembled at the schoolhouse in the evening for divine worship.
Thomas McGee opened the meeting and addressed the Indians. He first told them of our former wretched condition, and in doing this, he gave an account of the prodigal son, his depravity and his return, and welcome reception at his father's house. This, he said, was our situation when the Great Spirit met us and received us into his favor. The Dutch people who crowded the house looked on the Indian speaker with astonishment.
pagan Indians. They're the ones that are speaking now. Brothers, we have come to inquire of you of some things we have heard concerning your religion. We have been told that your ministers give the Indians some medicine to drink to wash their hearts, and that the tribe, they pour water upon their bodies to make them clean all over. And that after the Indians is thus washed, he cares no more about drinking the fire water. Are these things so?
Brothers, we have never been so served. What you have been told is not true. When we became Christians, the only thing the ministers did to us was that they poured some water on our heads in the name of the Great Spirit. They gave us no medicine to drink.
The pagan Indians again. Brothers, what is the matter with one of your Christian brothers? They alluded to an Indian who had been among the Christian Indians, but was never received into their communion, who was here some time since. We understood he was a Christian, but he would get drunk and fight and steal. He took away a gun that he had borrowed and sold it for whiskey.
Brothers, this is the case with all who are not faithful to the Great Spirit. Such will become more wicked and more miserable than they were before. No one can overcome his evil ways, but those who are faithful to the Great Spirit.
Pagan Indians again. Brothers, how is it with white people all around us? They say they are Christians, but we see them quarrel, fight, cheat, and get drunk. Is this the way the Christians live and act?
Christian Indians, brothers, Jesus Christ our Savior has condemned all such wicked practices. The white people are not all good Christians. Many who live in this Christian land are very wicked. They do not mind what the Great Spirit has told them and give up their wicked ways. All those who say they are Christians, when they act thus wickedly, are not true Christians. They do not keep the word of the Great Spirit.
Pagan Indians, brothers, you have heard that the Christian Indians, after they begin to pray, never dream about anything. Is this the case?
Christian Indians. The Christian Indians have dreams as well as others, but dreams are nothing. We do not live by dreaming. Dreams will never save us.
Pagan Indians. We also hear that the Christians have no souls. Is this true? Our conjurers say that they cannot see nor find any souls about the Christian Indians, as they can of others who are not Christian.
Christian Indians. It is on account of our souls that we pray to the Great Spirit, that our souls, when we die, may live forever with the Great Spirit. No person can find or see the soul of a Christian. The Great Spirit has charge of the souls of his own faithful people, so that no conjurer can do anything with their souls.
Pagan Indians. We have been informed that the Christian Indians have thrown away their medicine bags and all their magical instruments.
Christian Indians. All the praying Indians have given up their old customs. They have renounced all their heathenist customs and thrown away those medicine bags. On giving up their wicked ways, they prayed to the great good Spirit to accept of their bodies and souls, and to bless and help them to serve all their days. Our brothers then proceeded to unfold to them the miseries of heathenism and drunkenness. They spoke from past experience, having themselves once been in that wretched state. They also declared the joys and happiness they felt in their hearts since they began to serve the great good Spirit.
During the last discourse, this is Lynn, the pagan Indians appeared thoughtful and responded at the close of each sentence, thereby assenting to the things which were told to them by the Christian Indians. These exchanges made a favorable impression in the minds of several of the pagan Indians. It was agreed that Thomas McGee and perhaps others would soon visit them again and teach them more perfectly the way of the Lord.
Ryerson only began work on school issues on his appointment in 1844, but stories in the Christian Guardian show him raising the issue as early as 1831 in a story on Upper Canada Academy. So now quoting from Ryerson. On the importance of education generally, we may remark it is as necessary as the light. It should be as common as water and as free as air. A young man commencing in the world without education is like a mariner going to sea without any knowledge of navigation. There is a possibility of his getting into some desired port, but it is only a possibility. Education to the mind is like hands to the body. They are essential to most of the pursuits of ordinary life, though they may be sometimes abused to the worst of purposes.
So those were Ryerson's words, and we continue on in Ryerson's words. Education among the people is the best security of good government and constitutional liberty. It yields a steady, unbending support to the former and effectually protects the latter. An educated people are always a loyal people to good government, and the first object of a wise government should be the education of the people.
And educated people are always enterprising in all kinds of general and local improvements. An ignorant population are equally fit and liable to be the slaves of despots and the dupes of demagogues. Sometimes, like the unsettled ocean, they can be thrown in incontrollable agitation by every wind that blows. At other times, like the stupid donkey, they tamely submit to the most unreasonable burdens.
Okay, so those were Ryerson's words written in 1831. These are Lynn McDonald's words written in 2025. Also in 1831, Ryerson reported on advances in education in other countries. He was especially impressed with German schools. We will see that in making the case for education, Ryerson pointed out such practical benefits as, quote, fewer crimes and far less poverty and misery among the people. Sound familiar, by the way? We begin with education in Europe, and these are Ryerson's words in 1831. Within the last 30 years, a public school has been established in every parish of Württemberg, Baden, Hesse, Bavaria, and some other German states. Württemberg, a Protestant state, is regarded as one of the most highly civilized in Europe. The people read and think. Libraries are numerous in the towns and villages. There are fewer crimes and far less poverty and misery than in England. The dress and appearance of the people indicate a greater degree of comfort than is to be found in any country of Europe except Sweden and the lowlands of Scotland.
The provision of public instruction in France is very defective. The exertions of societies and individuals to establish public schools were opposed by the Catholic clergy and by the late government. The new government, it is believed, is laboring to promote the instruction of its subjects. Late French writers estimate that there are at present in France 6 million of children of an age to attend school, but not more than 1.5 million are in the way of being instructed.
A few more words from Ryerson in 1831. In addition to the 4.5 million of children left uneducated, it is calculated that about 10 million of adults, being about 1/3 of the whole population, can neither read nor write.
The importance of common schools, that is, elementary education, appeared in a note to Mr. Editor. While education seems to be the topic of the day, and much is said respecting colleges and academies, albeit established in different parts of our rapidly improving province, common schools are, in a great measure, overlooked. High schools, I admit, are highly important and necessary to persons able to afford their children the opportunity of attending them, but such form but a small portion of the community. It is to common schools that the greater part of the youth must look to for useful knowledge.
Again, Lynn's words here. A member of the House of Assembly tried to get a law adopted in 1831, duly reported in the Christian Guardian, here abbreviated. Now these are Ryerson's words. We publish a bill for the promotion of general education now under the consideration of the House of Assembly, introduced by Mr. Buell. Mr. Buell introduced a similar or the same bill during the last session, which we believe was lost by the casting vote of the Speaker. The bill has been printed by order of the House for examination, for criticism, for improvement. On its provisions, as well as on the general objects of the bill, we will take the liberty to offer a few remarks. Appropriations for the common school are small, but more liberal than at present. These are Ryerson's words in 1831.
Okay, Lynn's background words here. A sizable extract from the New York Farmer in 1832 made the case for a broad base of education, with science, literature, and philosophy as core subjects. Of course, with the capacity of each individual's mind, pecuniary ability had to be counted, as well as the resources of mind, physical, and moral energy. In time, Ryerson would call for the inclusion of scientific agriculture in the school system.
So these are Lynn's commentary here. A report on a speech from the throne by the Lieutenant Governor in 1833, while without specifics, recalled that the important subject of public education had occupied much of their attention and would continue to demand their, quote, early notice and consideration. It referred to the sale of school lands to pay for the superior district schools. The item ended by quoting a vague reference to, quote, facilitating the diffusion of education among all classes.
Okay, continuing with the historical information from Lynn. An item School Report of New York State gave such basic details from the Superintendent of Common Schools report for 1833 as the number of schools, the number reporting, and funding. To Ryerson, this would have shown how New York State was ahead of Upper Canada.
And just finishing this part. An item taken from a New York paper reported a letter from a gentleman in Constantinople that reported use of the Lancasterian method in schools in Turkey. I looked that one up so I can answer questions about that. The schools in Turkey, a method that used pupil teachers alongside the regular teacher. The same spirit prevailed there as in Egypt, where already there were 2 schools with 700 youths.
You can see this is early days because Ryerson from 1844 on was working on this, but here he's just snatching what he can see, and it's very, very limited. So we want the one next on democratic reform, please.
Ryerson made much of the passing of the Great Reform Act in the British Parliament in 1832 after years of struggle against the conservative forces led by the Duke of Wellington, the great conqueror of Napoleon. The Mr. Goulburn mentioned was an anti-reform MP next to the Duke of Wellington.
Any of you who don't know the Great Reform Bill, that was a measure to extend the franchise. It was very controversial. The conservative forces, including the Duke of Wellington, did not want to happen. But the people rose up and staged many demonstrations insisting that it be put through, and it was.
The extension of what exactly, Ron?
The franchise, the vote.
Franchise, okay. Yeah.
It was very limited. It was controlled in many cases in the immediate area. So the people, the average people really didn't have any control over things. So this was important.
Perhaps you could explain pocket boroughs and rotten boroughs?
Pocket boroughs and rotten boroughs. Yeah, basically these were in somebody's pocket, the pocket bureaus. In these areas, there weren't enough voters to overcome the conservatives. This is the thing. And this is one of the reasons why the Great Reform Bill was insisted upon by many people. There are actually armed demonstrations around the country demanding this be put through. And as you'll see, eventually it was. The item reporting the good news is titled simply, Latest from England, Political State of England. The historically minded will remember that the first Great Reform in England took place at Runnymede in 1215, and the Bill of Rights dates to 1689.
Is the present Parliament to be relied upon? Notoriously not. The Duke of Wellington, at the opening of the session, reckoned upon a hard run between him and the reforms. But what has happened since? Why England has spoken, towns and countries, rich and poor, the middle classes everywhere are pledged, not like the Whig ministers, to grant reform, but as a free people ought to do. They say with one voice, they will insist upon it.
Let a new cabinet then, we care not who it consists of, should even Mr. Goulburn himself be at the head of it, any new ministry attempt to drown the cry of reform in that of revolution, there is not one village in the United Kingdom whence petitions will not pour upon the sovereign to dismiss such a government of traitors.
By July, there was a hopeful turn. It was rumored that many of the peers have come over to the side of reform and named 8. It was, it continued, in the interest of the spiritual peers, the bishops, to come in also. By submitting, they will avoid these violent measures which may finally break down the hierarchy.
In November, second reading in the Lords was announced. Earl Grey, its great advocate, spoke amidst the most profound silence. The story also cited another paper, the Courier. Lynn mentioned this. It was very common to take news from other newspapers and reprint it. If strength of argument, closeness of reasoning, boldness of diction, above all the honest sincerity of truth, could have their due weight in the House of Lords, the speech of Earl Grey must have carried conviction to those to whom it was addressed. But as the race is not always to the swift, or the battle to the strong, so truth and reason do always possess the ascendancy, which for the interests of mankind at large they ought to have.
A short note informed readers that the Reform Bill had passed the House of Commons, but in the House of Lords, no surprise, the anti-reformers appear to hold out to the last. Next, it was reported that the bill had been thrown out by a majority of 41, but there were new converts to the necessity, if not the cause of reform. Bishops strong in defeat of last bill, and not better now. Soon after, Ryerson published extracts from a long speech by the Lord Chancellor, Lord Brougham, a leading reform advocate. He supported Earl Grey's efforts and stressed the feelings of the people for reform.
Finally, the Lords passed a third reading of the bill and royal assent was given. Very few peers were present at the final signing ceremony. 5 names were given, all staunch reformers. Only 2 on the opposite side of the House, the Conservatives, but the gallery was crowded. The King did not attend, but his son, the Duke of Sussex, substituted for him. He congratulated Earl Grey on the triumph of reform and shook hands with its supporters.
Later, in an excerpt from 1839, Ryerson used the British recedents to make the case for reforms in Canada, both freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, with compliments to the yeomanry of Yonge Street. By the Bill of Rights of 1689, the subjects of Great Britain are secured in their right to meet and discuss all political questions and express by petition their opinions therein to the sovereign. The Honourable Thomas Erskine, afterwards Lord Erskine, says, "The right of the people to meet and petition is a right, not a new imagination, sanctioned by the most unimpeachable authorities, and in the prosecuting by legal means, no man incurs either guilt or censure."
On this right is founded the right of His Majesty to the throne, and he himself, that is Mr. Erskine, had maintained in Parliament in opposition to the newly adopted tenets of Mr. Burke. Such is the opinion of one of the first lawyers and the most eloquent man of his day, pronounced before a British jury and ratified by their verdict. We're now going on to Upper Canada. In 1839, there was a rebellion in 1837. and the reformers, the people who wanted more power for the people, were all essentially termed to be rebels. It was very difficult for them to carry on with the demand for reform. The British government sent over Lord Durham to investigate things, so the reformers titled themselves Durham Clubs, and they met to discuss reform, to try and separate them from the rebellion. In 1839, there was a meeting at Finch's Tavern on Yonge Street of the Durham Club, and a group of men, led by the sheriff of the home district, broke in carrying axe handles and started to beat people. And one person died. The meeting on Yonge Street was lawfully assembled and for a lawful object. There was not, even from the showing of the Patriot was the conservative newspaper in Toronto, the remotest appearance of irregularity. There was even the Patriot agreement that they weren't doing anything wrong. There was no riot act read, yet the meeting was dispersed and chased off the ground, and murder was committed under the direction of the sheriff of the district, while the mayor of Toronto with his posse comitatus were on the spot.
Of that most disgraceful transaction, the sheriff was the leader, the instigator, and what right had he to be there at all? Who now will have confidence in the purity of justice in the country, when sheriffs who have the power of packing juries become leaders of illegal mobs who murder the lieges of Her Majesty, and where the head of the colonial government passes by the political delinquency and leaves the question of murder or no murder to the legal tribunals. The yeomanry of Yonge Street deserve every praise. They came peaceably, and they came to do the work of peace, unarmed. And when brutally attacked, they broke not the laws of either God or man. It is to be hoped that they will continue to preserve the character they had so nobly earned, and while they avoid revenge, they will be, if possible, more determined than ever to get rid of a faction that intellectually, morally, and politically are a foul blot on the face of this fair land.
Well, the first remarks are from Lynn on the evils of slavery, along with the efforts to abolish it, were subjects that Ryerson took up right from the beginning of his time as editor of the Christian Guardian. Some of the items reported were short, such as fearful cargo, 1830. The slave ship Fame of Cadiz arrived in Havana from the coast of Africa, landed 3,000 old sick slaves on the coast to windward of Matanas, and lost 600 slaves and 60 of her crew, all on her passage from Africa.
An item from Florida entitled Strange Legislation showed the extent to which slaves were treated as property. The governor had recommended passage of a law which would, if a slave was executed for the murder of another slave, the value of the murdered slave would be paid to the owner from the treasury, the cost divided by the other owners.
Brazil was the largest slave state in the New World, and with its Portuguese foundations, a major slave trader. A letter from Rio de Janeiro to the Christian Guardian conveyed this, but a single fact, this time to show the dreadful character of the slave trade. The Brazilian government derives a large revenue from the importation of slaves by laying a duty of so much per head immediately on their arrival, without regard to their health or condition. When vessels, therefore, which have slaves on board arrive off the port, a general survey takes place by the physician, and those poor wretches, whose existence is doubtful, are thrown overboard in order to save the duty.
An excerpt taken from the British Christian Advocate in 1830 called for political action on abolition. It noted that Christians attending a Methodist conference in England were decidedly sympathetic with the 74,000 Negro slaves in the West Indies who were exposed to the most cruel hardships and oppressions. They asked their fellow Methodists to employ their elective franchise at this period exclusively in favor of those candidates who distinctly pledged themselves to support measures for the abolition of slavery through the British dominions. So that's Proceedings of the Methodist Conference, August 4th, 1830, Christian Guardian, Volume 1, number 51, November 6th, 1830, 409. Sorry.
Also in England, a meeting on the 7th of May, 1830, featured 3 top speakers for abolition: William Wilberforce, Thomas Fowell Buckton, and Lord Brougham. The report mentions that one man spoke against abolition but was scarcely able to proceed on account of a constant expression of disappropriation. This was from the Christian Guardian in September of 1830, yes. I'll skip the volume. The same issue reported on quote, colony of blacks in Upper Canada, end of a quote, at a town named after William Wilberforce.
These colored people had immigrated about a year earlier from Cincinnati and the vicinity. They had purchased land and were already producing small crops. Their agent in the United States was raising money for Wilberforce thanks to clergy in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio taking up collections for them. Some 1,100 had left Ohio for this Wilberforce area for last year, and more were on the way. That's from a different issue of the same.
A short item appeared in the London Female Anti-Slavery Society, sent the American Colonization Society a donation of £650 in aid of defraying the expenses of transporting to Liberia 600 slaves offered to the society by their owners in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. That was reported in January of 1831.
An excerpt taken from the British Christian Advocate called for political action on abolition. It noted that Christians attending a Methodist conference in England were decidedly sympathetic with the 74,000 Negro slaves in the West Indies who were exposed to the most cruel hardships.
Hardships and oppressions. The Christian Guardian reported a recommendation unanimously adopted at a dissenters' charity school meeting with Lord John Russell in the chair. Convinced that Negro slavery is one of the foulest of our national sins and ought, on grounds strictly religious, to be strenuously opposed by all who fear God, the conference earnestly recommends to all our members and friends who now are or hereafter may be possessed of the elected franchise, which I guess was spoken, to pay conscientious and paramount regard to the slave question and support such candidates only as such in connection with other qualifications for a seat in the Senate of the country professing Christianity. Decidedly pledge themselves in favor of a speedy and effective legislative enactment for the extinction of this most unchristian system. Reported in December of 1831.
Ryerson was in England when the last debate on the abolition of slavery was held, as was mentioned earlier today. He managed to be in the House of Commons to hear it and reported on it at length in the Christian Guardian, from which we will give some excerpts. The speech was by Edward Stanley, later the 14th Earl of Derby, and someone with whom Ryerson would later correspond. Stanley's speech began with petitions for the immediate abolition of slavery, which showed how many people supported the abolition cause. He traced the history of the question since its first agitation in 1792 by Mr. Burke down to the present time, and quoted the opinions of those great statesmen who at different times had advocated the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the British dominions, and the plans of the different ministers to accomplish that object, or ameliorate the condition of the slave which had been proposed to the colonies.
Stanley remarked on the difficulties which surrounded the question and the clashing interests which it involved. 250,000 tons of shipping annually and a revenue of between £5 million and £6 million, not only the interests of a vast body of proprietors resident in the colonies and this country, whose very existence depended upon the issue of the question, but also the temporal interests of between 700,000 and 800,000 of our fellow subjects and of their descendants throughout generations yet unborn. And observe that the government was placed between two conflicting parties, one having a deep pecuniary interest in the question, intimately associated with the subject, connected with the colonies by social ties, and at present laboring under embarrassments which rendered them doubly jealous of any measure which might affect their interests.
On the other hand, a universal and extended expression of feeling pervaded the country, and there was never a time when the determination of the people was more absolutely or more irresistibly expressed. Because it was founded on that deep religious feeling, on that common conviction of principle which admitted of no palliative or compromise, and which pronounced itself in a voice to which no minister could be deaf. The time had gone by when Parliament could decide the question whether slavery should or should not be perpetual. The question now to be decided was, what was the safest, what was the speediest and the most effectual mode procuring its final and entire abolition?
The speech went on to cover earlier efforts at amelioration of the conditions of the slaves, far short of abolition, such as allowing slave marriages, preventing slaves from being separated from their families, rules for manumission, the right of slaves to possess property, provisions for slaves to establish savings accounts, and abolition of corporal punishment by the owner. Not a colony without a single exception, but scornfully rejected them. Some of them had gone through the form of carrying the outline of the shadow of some of the bills into effect, but all studiously avoided the substance.
There were comments on how much worse conditions for the slaves had become when the price for sugar declined. The slaves were forced to produce more and more. On the ground of humanity, Mr. Stanley called upon the committee to abolish slavery, for as the distress of the planters had increased, they had recourse to raising a greater quantity of sugar, which was attended by a frightful sacrifice of human life by overworking the Negroes. And he entered into a comparative statement with reference to 6 West India colonies, showing the decrease of the slave population according to the increase of the quantity of sugar raised.
The subject moved on to the religious instruction of the slaves and the need to counter the view that they were, quote, unfitted for participation in the blessings of liberty because they had no education, no religious feelings, but were ignorant and brutal. If this charge was just, on whom did the guilt fall? Hear, hear, applause evidently. Who was to blame? That the Negro was still ignorant if he was, and that he lacked industrious habits.
Was it not those who regarded him from the childhood to the grave, and from generation to generation, as a mere laboring animal, who took no pains to cultivate his mind and raise his moral feelings? Nay, more, and he spoke it to the shame of Christian age and a professedly Christian country, who were permitted to deprive the Negro of the means of religious instruction, because they feared it was incompatible with the maintenance of a state of slavery. And that's the more cheers. But assuming that the religious instruction was inconsistent with the continuance of slavery, would that house shut out the light of gospel truth and stifle education on purpose that at all hazards and at all risks the system of slavery might be preserved? Question. And more cheers for that as well.
He believed that from the state of most of the colonies belonging to other countries, they might draw a lesson of deep censure themselves.
He compared the requirement of giving religious instructions to slaves in Catholic countries. He asked the following.
Had any such system prevailed in the English colonies? Hear, hear. Lots of applause. He had no wish to touch on any point of an irritating nature, nor to refer further to the obstacles which had been put in the way of the spread of religious instruction in the colonies. But this he would say, that House would ill discharge its duty if it did not put forth its authoritative declaration that throughout all the possessions of His Majesty, the benefit of religious instruction and the free choice of religious worship should be left undisputed to all classes of the King's subjects. Cheers.
Stanley paid tribute to William Wilberforce's work as he concluded his sublime and beautiful remarks. Wilberforce died on July 29, 1833, a week after the crucial debate in the House of Commons, and before approval in the House of Lords and royal assent.
There are those who first started this mighty question and broached its godlike principles, who have not lived to see the triumph which he reserved for it in these days. They labored in their generation strenuously and vigorously for that fulfillment which we are now about to accomplish. They were satisfied with the foundation which it was their fortune to lay, and they trusted that it would be strong enough to support the glorious superstructure which is now about to be reared upon it. Like the prophets of old, they hailed the day star from on high and exulted in that prospect which they saw through a glass darkly, and not as we do face to face.
It is not, however, without feelings of the deepest and most heartfelt satisfaction that I recall to your recollection the fact that one man, the most religiously inspired, the most conscientiously influenced of all who labored in the dawn and the rising of this great and glorious cause, Wilberforce, and everybody's cheering, still remains to witness the final consummation of that important triumph to which his early energies were devoted, and to exclaim, like the last of the great prophets to whom which I have before alluded, Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace. And great cheering to that final statement.
The abolition law was adopted in 1833 and came into force on the 1st of August, 1834. The Christian Guardian reported on the celebrations held both in England and in the West Indian colonies. A poem excerpted from the London Patriot celebrated the last night of slavery. That was the title of the poem, I guess. This is the poem. Let the floods clap their hands, let the mountains rejoice. From our own native sands, breathe the jubilant voice. It ended with this line. The sunlight has touched thy glad shores. Caribbees.
The Christian Guardian covered the progress of abolition in the West Indies, from the adoption of the Act in British Parliament to the adoption of the required laws in their own legislatures. That for Antigua reported the passing of an act for the total and unconditional abolition of slavery after the first day of the next August. So that was from a particular volume entitled Antigua. A similar item noted that the colonial legislature of the Bahamas was closed with a conciliatory speech from the lieutenant governor on the 20th of March. The session was conducted with much ceremony, during which thousands will rejoice to learn an act to abolish slavery in the Bahama Islands was passed and sent to His Majesty's government. That's from another volume.
A helpful item set out the numbers of free whites, free colored persons, and slaves for the 17 colonies of the British West Indies. The total number of slaves was 687,300. For Jamaica, numbers were given only for whites at 37,000 and slaves at 322,000. For the other colonies, all three categories were given, all showing much larger numbers of slaves than whites. In Trinidad, for example, there were 4,200 whites and 16,000 free colored and 34,000 slaves. That was from June 1834 issue.
Also, an item in and of July 1834, or just before emancipation came into force, referred to the contest carried on for half a century for the perpetuation of slavery and its abolition. It added that England had consented to give 20 millions or the extinction of Negro slavery, the sum the UK government had to borrow to pay off the slave owners.
Celebrations of the end of slavery in Bermuda went peacefully, as befitted its having had the mildest form of slavery and influence of the extensive Sunday schools. The celebrations began with religious services to go on to hilarity, song, and cordial greetings. Intelligence from St. Kitts and Trinidad were otherwise, and Marines from 4 ships moved in and took prisoners and whipped them.
An exceptional scholarly note, also from 1834, showed how valuable slaves were to their masters in ancient Rome. The example was Pomponius Atticus, a wealthy banker and correspondent of the philosopher Cicero.
The slaves of Atticus were indispensable to his literary ease and enjoyment. Many persons derived more vulgar advantages from the skill of their slaves in the mechanical arts and the bondmen who ministered successfully to the luxury of their master. However, he might occasionally suffer from his avarice. He was too important to personal comfort. That's from The Value of Roman Slaves in the Market, Christian Guardian, 1834.
And celebrations took place when abolition came into force in 1834. This is Ryerson reported in the Christian Guardian. One celebration was a ceremony held by the Baptist Chapel in Red Lion Square, London, led by 2 escaped or freed West Indian enslaved persons. A chain on a whip, shackles, and collar were brought before a large audience. The Baptist minister, Joseph Ivamy, cried out, "Is he not a man and a brother?" The chain and whip were broken in one blow to loud cheers. The collar and shackles were similarly dispatched. One of the former slaves called out, "The chain is broken and the sons of men are free. Hurrah! The chain is broken and Africa's sons are free." To tremendous cheering.
That came from a special issue entitled "The Abolition of Slavery." A comment in the Christian Guardian in 1835 on the West Indian missions pointed out that emancipation had actually taken place since their last issue came out. And the quotation here is, "The arrival and celebration of this most auspicious day," end of quote, West Indian missions. Maybe that was a volume there.
Yeah. We rejoice to state that as far as our information reaches, it is of the most gratifying description, and we omit for the present many interesting letters of earlier date in order that no time may be lost in making our friends of the Christian public partakers of our joy, by inserting at length the following delightful documents. To God be all the praise. From our brethren in Jamaica, no letters have arrived, but such as we were written before the day of emancipation. But the general tenor of their latest previous communications warrants the indulgence of the most cheering hopes.
No legislative enactment, however just and salutary, could undo at once the moral and social injury inflicted alike on the dominant and the servile classes by ages of oppression and wrong. Further, even with repentance and renunciation of former sin, it would take years to come to pay the righteous penalty of previous negligence and opposition.
The day arrived when the state of slavery in the British colonies, according to the decision of the legislature, should forever cease. We congratulate you on this happy accomplishment of your ardent desires. The bondage of the Negroes has now become a mere matter of past history and no longer oppresses the servant or demoralizes the master. We deeply regret the fact that there are yet in the states, professedly Christian, where the sinfully degrading caste of color exists in its most repulsive form. But we are willing to cherish the hope that the example of Great Britain will be followed by every other nation, and that slavery, at least among all people calling themselves Christian, will be allowed to continue no longer. God hath made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and we anticipate the time when, by the admission and triumph of this great truth, that all civil distinctions arising merely from color and complexion will be abolished.
Editors after Ryerson continued to cover the slave issue. A note, for example, in 1847 states that there were 10,000 slaves in South Africa of 30,000 people.
And he also had the occasion to return to the issue in 1850 while in Boston en route to England, when a large public meeting took place to protest the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in September 1850. That law gave slave owners the right of return of their runaways, even those who had reached a free state in the North. Slave owners offered bounties or rewards to slave catchers. This stepped-up law on fugitive slaves made escape to Canada necessary to be sure of remaining free. The Underground Railroad, a system of safe houses to assist slaves to escape to freedom, in existence since the early 19th century, had to be extended to Canada.
In his report entitled Notes of a Traveler in Europe, Ryerson identified himself as an esteemed friend rather than by name. The event was presided over by a descendant of two early presidents, John Adams II and John Quincy Adams VI. That came from a volume in 1850, Christian Guardian. While I was in Boston, a great public meeting of some 4,000 or 5,000 persons was held in the famous Faneuil Hall. It was presided over by Mr. Adams, son and grandson of the ex-president of the United States, whose portraits were placed on the wall just over where he sat. I attended from curiosity, never having witnessed the proceedings of a public meeting in the United States. The proceedings were conducted in a very orderly manner and were commenced with prayer.
The subject was the Fugitive Slave Law, which was lately passed by Congress. The principles involved were the rights of man and the authority of Congress. The determination was to trample underfoot the latter and maintain the former. Some of the speakers were able and made mention of the many colored persons who had years ago escaped from slavery and had long lived as peaceable citizens in free states, but who were now fleeing to Canada for personal security and liberty.
It appeared strange and almost incredible to me that in the city of Boston, the cradle of American liberty, and in sight of Bunker Hill Monument, either human liberty must be sacrificed or treason avowed against the supreme law of the land. And the very law in question was voted for by the representatives of the city of Boston in Congress.
It appeared remarkable also as a historical fact that the British provinces are the only portion of North America where the liberty of man is secured without respect to color or race. Canada must thus be a great annoyance to the slaveholders and slave advocates of the United States. and may prompt them, with the cooperation of certain newspapers and parties in Canada, to renewed efforts for Canadian annexation, that the people of Canada, like the citizens of the northern states, emancipated from the oppression of British freedom, may be enfranchised into a general and effective police of neighbor hunters and slave catchers.
Ryerson went on to state that he did not regard slavery as peculiar to any one form of government, than to condone with the many thousands of intelligent, noble advocates of constitutional liberty in the United States. He drew comparisons with Canada, naturally in our favor, but I have been surprised to find that while such a prodigious practical individual development is evinced among our American neighbors, the developments of a truly free constitutional government are so very imperfect, and the practical application of its principles so perfectly and partially understood. Certain principles they do understand and carry them out nobly, especially in respect to the diffusion of education and general knowledge. But in regard to the true principles of civil government and political economy generally, I am persuaded the Americans can learn more from Canadians than can the latter from the former. But this is not a subject on which I am disposed to enlarge. I rejoice that a more intelligent and liberal feeling is growing up between the two countries, in the cultivation of which each will borrow from the other what shall be deemed more useful and perfect that which it adopts.
And this short section had to do with injustices to Native people. Ryerson in 1832 published speeches of Indian chiefs of Prince Edward Island, in which they praised their treatment by the French earlier arrivals and condemned that by the British.
To the great councillors of Prince Edward Island, the speech of Oliver Thomas, Louis Francis Elginot, Paul Jacques, and other chiefs of the island. Fathers, before the white man crossed the great waters, our woods offered us food and clothes in plenty. The waters gave us fish, and the woods game. Our fathers were sturdy, brave, and free. We knew no want. We were the only owners of the land. Fathers, when the French came to us, they asked us for land to set their wigwams. We gave it to them freely. In return, they taught us new arts, protected and cherished us, sent holy men to our fathers amongst us who taught us Christianity, who made books for us, and taught us how to read them. That was good, and we were grateful.
Fathers, when your fathers came and drove away our French fathers, we were left alone. Our people were sorry, but they were brave. They roused the war cry and took up the tomahawk against your fathers. Then your fathers spoke to us and said, "Put up the axe. We will protect you. We will become your fathers." Our fathers and your fathers had long talks around the council fire. The hatchets were buried, and we became friends.
Fathers, they promised to leave us some of our land, but they did not. They drove us from place to place like wild beasts, and that was not just.
Fathers, last year at your great council, you promised to give us land and to give us books to show our children good things, to know the good spirit and to love him. That was kind. We thank you. But fathers, we hear that some bad Indians who are lazy and who hate work said we did not want land or books. This is not true. We cannot live by the chase, and we wish our children to learn.
Fathers, we heard you would give us the books our fathers left us, but strange ones. We were sorry, but we hope you'll give us our own and no other. Fathers, our tribe in Nova Scotia, Canada, New Brunswick, and Cape Breton have land on which their families are happy. We ask you, fathers, to give us part of that land once our fathers, whereupon we may raise our wigwams without disturbance and plow and sow, that we may live and our children also. Else, fathers, may soon see not a drop of Indian blood in this land, once our own. Where is now our land? We have none.
Fathers, we are poor. Do not forsake us. Remember the promises your fathers made to ours. Fathers, we salute you.
I mean, you can see there's a great variety of material in the Christian Guardian. We don't have much time, but Ron has kindly agreed to make a few remarks more generally about journalism to fit the Christian Guardian in with what else is going on. Thank you.
Yes, won't be long. Newspapers in what was then Upper Canada were few and far between. If they had a circulation of 100 people, they were doing well. So these newspapers came and went. So in Toronto in the late 1830s, there would have been 3 newspapers. The Patriot, we already mentioned, the conservative one. And there would usually be one on the liberal side, the reform side. They were very partisan, which is one of the reasons they didn't have a lot of subscribers. There were a lot of meetings before the rebellion of 1837 when some people rose up against the government. And the Patriot would report on them, and William Lyon Mackenzie, who was the most radical of the reformers, in his newspaper would report on them. And if you read those accounts, you wouldn't know you were in the same meeting. That's how different things were. So if you were reform-minded, you bought a reform newspaper. If you were conservative, you bought a conservative newspaper. But even there, newspapers were expensive. They were made out of linen cotton, not pulpwood. You had to pay also for the postage, and postage was expensive. The British government controlled the post office, and they charged a lot to ship things. So a lot of people didn't subscribe. Some didn't subscribe because they couldn't read. So those that did would often either give it to their neighbor, or if the neighbor couldn't read, would read it to them. So again, this restricted the number of people who subscribed. Lynn pointed out early on that the Christian Guardian was selling books and things like this. They had to do this. They had to do everything they can to make ends meet. And these newspapers disappeared regularly. The Cleveland Advocate went out of business in 1836, for instance. So along came the Christian Guardian. It was not a partisan newspaper, except when it came to the issue of state support for churches. They were totally against it. So in 1829, they had 450 subscribers. That was huge. By 1832, with Ryerson in charge, it had 3,000 subscribers, and not just members of the Methodist Church, because of the general knowledge that the general information they put in there. And even though Ryerson was not always the editor in the 30s, they brought him back because he did such a good job and he kept the readership up. So just to put this in perspective, this is a really successful publication compared to every other one. And part of it is Methodists supported it, but part of it is it did not take sides in a lot of these political disputes, I guess you'd call them. So I just wanted to say that just to explain why this is the Christian Guardian is such a big deal. So I guess we're going to entertain questions.
Thank you very much, Ron. Until we are thrown out, let's stay a little bit longer and invite people to make comments or ask questions about the material that's come up so far.
I have a question. Ron, earlier when you were speaking, the references to Bishop Strong, just exactly what was his position. He was one of the conservatives, wasn't he, that objected to the reform bill. Is that correct?
Bishop Strong was here in Toronto.
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
but his name comes up in what you were reading earlier.
The reason is that he was one of the members of the elite, so-called family compact. He's one of the main members, and he was one of the people pushing for the Church of England, the Anglican Church, to control education, to control marriage, to control all sorts of aspects in the colony.
Yeah.
And so he was, in a sense, Egerton Ryerson's chief rival.
Yeah.
Ryerson made his reputation by taking Strawn, who was considered a brilliant man, taking him on in print.
Yeah, I remember that from reading with Lynn. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is it true that they connected at the end of Ryerson's life?
Sorry, is it true what?
That they connected at the end of Ryerson's life?
Yes, apparently. Well, by that time the clergy reserves were over, so that fight was gone, in which they had great differences. But after all, they were both Christian men and active people. Apparently they were I haven't seen anything to flesh that out at all, but apparently they were on good terms. And Ryerson had no objection to the Anglican liturgy or to his doctrine. It was just the idea that the Anglican Church would get tax revenues for their ministers, and no one else would. And he didn't want to get the Methodists in on it. He wanted church members should support their own clergy, and the tax money should be going to education.
And I'm guessing that the number of printing presses would just about equal the number of newspapers. There was not a printing house on every corner.
No, in fact, the people who printed newspapers tried desperately to get the printing contract from the government to don't print government information because they had a really hard time making ends meet. So the Ryerson Press is a result of the Christian Guardian publishing things to try and add to the income.
So he kind of diffused polarization in the political sphere with the Christian Guardian.
Yes, and it was not totally devoid. In 1834, the British Wesleyan Methodists, they'd been in Upper Canada, they came back, small group, and they united with the Canadian Methodists. And they were taking, the British were, a very small amount of money for their Indian missions, as they were called. William Lyon Mackenzie denounced Ryerson for this, denounced the Methodist Church and said, how can you do this? You're being hypocritical. You're taking money and you say you shouldn't be taking money from the state. And this is one case where it did become political. And it hurt both Mackenzie and Ryerson, because Methodists, Log Methodists were reformers and they were upset about this because of Mackenzie. On the other hand, a lot of supporters of Ryerson thought that Mackenzie was inappropriate.
There was quite a diversity of material in the Christian Guardian. And so you have short items, for example, they're covering what's going on in the Catholic Church. And in other countries, and it just, you get world news spotted in and around. So it's quite interesting to read the material. And this was a Methodist publication, and yet they're covering, I think, in a fairly decent way, what the Catholics are doing, what the Baptists are doing, and so on.
I just, two things. First of all, I want to point out that in all of that, we heard a lot today, I didn't hear the term or the concept of residential schools mentioned at all. I think that bears just noting it, since we spent so much time delving into the things that Ryerson wrote. But one of the other accusations that gets thrown around these days all the time is the evils of colonization. But from what I'm taking from today, to the extent that colonization is good, bad, or otherwise, it sounds like it had already taken place. That everything that we're talking about in today's discussion takes place once colonization is well in place and everyone is dealing with it as a done deal. And I'm just wondering if you might comment and shed some light on that.
Good points there. Maybe Ron wants to comment. But the Royal Proclamation of 1763 basically ended the wars, Indian wars in Canada, not so in the U.S.
So, and the point I've made, other people made the point, by the 1830s, a large percentage of the Indigenous population in Upper Canada had converted to Christianity. Now, exactly what that means is another question. So, they'd already gone along with that aspect, and then the other issue was the fact that they signed treaties sharing the land with the white man, except the white man assumed that these treaties meant they owned the land then. So in order to survive, the Indigenous population said, we need to learn your ways. So in that sense, colonization had taken place. I wouldn't call it that, but I mean, in today's society, that's what they call it. So it already was a situation where the Indigenous people no longer could roam freely, and they needed to adopt, or they knew they would die. They knew they would disappear, and the point was made in the readings.
So, in other words, what they were asking for is assimilation.
No.
Well,
No, but what they are saying is the term that was used is civilization, meaning settling down, not being wiser or better, but settling down. And so you see this in some of the writings. These are men of the woods, but they can't keep hunting. Too much of that land is gone. They can't survive by game, so they have to be civilized, which means they have to settle down and learn farming.
but the point is, from the standpoint of the colonization process, as is described today, or what I think John is getting at, it was it was mutually desired. It wasn't something that was being imposed on.
Right. But Ryerson wanted Indigenous people to continue to know their own languages. So that they wanted them to be Christians, so he wanted Bible translations and hymn books and so on, so that they could be Christians in Ojibwe or in Mohawk. So in that sense, it's not assimilation, because they would keep their own languages.
I don't know that that's worth knowing.
I read a wonderful piece recently by a chief from the north, and he said, I became a Christian. And he does a much better job of describing it. He said, I have the Great Spirit, yeah, all that's all fine, but I kept all my own beliefs. And that's why I say what adopting Christianity meant was not what some people think it was assimilation.
Yes.
The people did keep their own points of view. So this man was going on with all of the, probably was going on with animism, the belief that rivers and streams and trees and so on had their own spirits. But he was saying, yes, you can be a Christian and you can still keep your beliefs. You just add that extra layer.
But you don't get that in Ryerson's Christian Guardian. You don't get that. But it's interesting. Bishop Grandin is one of the people who's been unnamed, and things that were named after him in Alberta have since disappeared. But he has some interesting material where he says you can be a good Christian without being civilized, meaning you can be a good Christian and still hunt in the woods. But you need to be civilized simply to survive, because the game isn't there. And so when you look at it, it's very clear you can be a good Christian in the woods.
Well, of course, these things happen in zigzagging ways, I guess. There was someone of the Indigenous community that was interviewed on CBC this morning. I don't know how many of you heard it. He's getting a Lifetime Achievement Award for having revived in his adult years as an educator some Indigenous customs and traditions that had been something he didn't know in his youth. And he evidently grew up in a community where he was the only Indigenous person in the school, and he would say he regretted that his parents encouraged him to drop traditional Indigenous ways. But it's only in his later years as an adult that he's begun to feel, I wouldn't say shortchanged, but took on the challenge of reviving all of this. I don't know where that sits within the definition of assimilation.
See, that's modern.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Indigenous people, after 1990, when Phil Fontaine came out and told Barbara Frum that he was abused and anybody that was in his classroom was abused, I think that was the tipping point or the learning point.
Why don't you use the mic so everyone can hear you?
That's where I think the Indigenous people started to get heavy into their
reviving their
revival,
customs.
because a lot of them were lost. A lot of them didn't know what it was to be an Indian, and I've met a lot of those people. The other thing is that the people within the last 2 decades, or maybe 4 decades, assumed that the Indigenous people from Ryerson's time had no capacity for intelligence. They were still very intelligent, and they were able to make a decision on their own. If they chose Christianity, they did it for a purpose, and because they were able to say, hey, this is a good thing. It wasn't like they were being, well, although we had people like Ryerson, who I love, would love to convert them, but they took it because there was a need. And I've been in places where even Indigenous people have treated the people back then as if they had no capacity for intelligent or decision making. They did, and a lot of the decisions they made back then, they did it with full kilt. So can I just say one quick Mark Bonikowski, you know Mark, who is a member of the Hall of Fame and a Ryerson graduate, and he's written a few pieces for friends of Ryerson.
Sorry, who is this?
Mark Bonikowski.
Oh, yes.
He's dying. He's down to his last month or so. And I was just wondering if there's anything that we could do. I'm trying to get contacted with, I think, somewhere in Ottawa, because I went to school in Manhattan. But I think as he contributed to us, to our cause, I don't know what we could do, but just maybe a card or something.
Is he still
is he in the hospital? You know?
No, is he responsive?
Well, I don't know. All I know is that he put out a piece, dramatic as a journalist would be, that he's not going to be here much longer.
I was just going to say, we could send him this interaction today. He might
Pardon
be
me?
very interested in it. This interaction today, he might be very interested in it. Austin has the copy.
Okay.
We're having a Zoom meeting on Sunday.
Tomorrow.
No, isn't it? Is it no?
It's tomorrow.
This Saturday.
Oh, yeah, today's Saturday. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Tomorrow, Sunday at 4:00. Perhaps that could be raised. That's kind of our business meeting, as it
Okay.
were. Yeah.
So we have a Zoom tomorrow?
A Zoom tomorrow at 4.
At 4.
You should have gotten it into a recent.
Oh, I'm
newsletter.
sorry. The only thing with me, and I apologize, once it's in my mind, if I don't say it then it's gone forever. And Mark has been a really great friend of the Indigenous people. He did the Red Road, which was
But I think he'd be very interested in today's discussion.
Well, we want to send a card
You're
of,
talking about something more
get well card or something.
sympathetic,
was not getting well. He ain't getting well.
You're more talking about a thank you, or
Yes.
there's a way to visit him, but he's probably too far.
dog.
Yeah, just to thank you
Yeah.
for, you
Well,
know,
if somebody could look it up to make, so that we can see
Yeah,
something
I'll-
appropriate.
I'll try to organize.
I just want to
Thank you.
ask you, is he part of Indigenous?
No,
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 okay.
no, he's, I think he's Polish, I think.
Yeah. It's-
Polish
that sounds
Canadian.
like a
I hate
Polish
saying that,
name.
he's a Canadian, okay,
Yeah.
but Polish grandfather or something.
Is that it for
Yep.
questions and comments and things? Yes, it is.
And Donald Smith's book, I can't believe I had it for 12 years and took the opportunity of him showing up here last month to get into it. And that's really a wonderful book. This is his second one, Mississauga Portraits, that talks about all the Mississauga.
Who is the author?
Oh, this is
Don
Don
Smith.
Yeah, Donald B. Smith, Don Smith, who was
Oh,
here,
okay. Yes, yes.
who was here quite
On
recently,
the
and
first
he's
issue.
really been the top person in the field. And he says he's now retired. I hope that you can still be retired and you know and get your own in a little bit.
He keeps retiring and he keeps doing more. I've been friends with him for over 50 years, and this is the last thing I'm doing, and next thing I see he's doing something else.
Okay, well, to everybody who took part, this was an experiment, and appreciate what the work that the readers have done and the discussion that we've had on this. You can see there's a lot to Ryerson that we can learn from. Really lots of good stuff. So I'm happy to be working on it because I know there's so much more. So.
Lynn, thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, that
Oh,
was
thank you.
interesting. Even for us, we can read it.